Isn't it amazing? I mean, to be here, I think you were just saying, it's a once in a lifetime experience.
It is. It's so far away from us. It took me 10 hours to Europe. I spent a week in Europe, and now it's almost another 7 8 hour to this place.
But I think considering, I guess, a passion clearly we both share in the climate space, and I mean, we're both in the climate finance space. I mean, to come here and see firsthand, I think what is actually happening. I mean, I certainly find it motivational.
Now, my first impression is so clean here. Air is clean, water is clean, food is safe.
It's the silence.
It's amazing. This is what the developing countries are dreaming for many decades, and we need to protect this place. But on top of that, what we cannot see is the impact of global warming, as we saw from the professor yesterday. He shows all these impact of fossil fuel burning on climate, and temperature maybe rising 3-4 degrees this century, which means that ice melt and sea level is going to increase.
No, exactly.
Quite dramatically, and a lot of coastal areas will be underwater.
Well, that was Dr. Michael Mann, and I found what I found really interesting from that presentation was how warming here is affecting what we're seeing, the extreme weather events we've seen this year in 2018, the hurricanes, the heat waves. But so, I mean, turning to you, I think what's fascinating is you've become a bit of a hero to us. Previous chief economist at the Chinese Central Bank, and now I believe you're with a think tank at Tsinghua University.
That's
you
right.
wear multiple hats. So you're chairing the China Green Finance Committee, is that right?
That's right.
Why has this become so important in China? Because I think still, many outside of China, I was going to say the West, but I think outside of China, still have this perception that China is behind in these things. But the reality is China's become a real leader, particularly in the area of climate finance. I mean, why is that? Well, what's driving that, do you think?
Well, what really happened is last few years China began to launch its green finance initiative. I think for people who are not watching the space for the last 3-4 years, they probably had the impression that China is behind. But in fact, relative to many other countries, you can see the China introduction of green finance policy was leading. We introduced the Green Finance Guideline in 2016, which is the first set of comprehensive policy guidelines on green finance. And it was later followed by many other countries, including EU's introduction of action plan on sustainable finance. And we introduced a mandatory requirement for climate and environmental information disclosure for listed companies to be implemented in 3 phases from 2017 to 2020. So by 2020, China will be the only large economy that has introduced a mandatory requirement for environmental information disclosure. Plus, we launched a green bond market in 2016. It's later than Europe, but it became number 1 in terms of size in that year.
That was fascinating yesterday. I mean, the comment that China is now the green bonds leader. And I'm struck by I've just come here almost from the GCAS, the Global Climate Action Summit in San Francisco. And the contrast, I think, with China, where your central government, your president, is very bought in to this agenda and this sort of green transformation, whereas in the United States now, they're having to do this bottom up, despite the federal government.
Right. I think leadership and support is so important. In China, at the time we proposed the idea to the central government, it was immediately endorsed on establishing the green financial system. Then our president, our premier, our central bank governor, and all the deputy governors were talking about green finance, its importance and its actions. So it mobilized a lot of support from the entire economy, including all the major banks, institutional investors. They were mobilized, and they created sort of internal plan for green finance initiative. And also we promoted this to the global stage, including China initiating the G20 Green Finance Study Group, which Michael Sharon and I were chairing over the past 3 years.
Michael Sharon from the Bank of England.
From Bank of England.
Yes.
And that, I think, indeed mainstream the idea of green finance among policymakers globally.
And you're also very involved in the sort of G20 as well, on this whole
Yeah,
space?
G20, it's a study group which used to be called G20 Green Finance Study Group, launched in 2016, and now it's been the third year. And as a spillover of this G20 work on green finance, French, Chinese, UK, Germany, and other central banks launched a central banks and supervisors network on green financial system, which I think is another great initiative. This network will be looking at various options on how regulators can push for green finance, and one of the work stream, which is called supervision work stream, that I chair under the network, will be looking into whether we should be reducing risk weights on green assets.
So this is the
for
sort of
the
role,
banking sector.
the role of central banks as their
It's
supervisory.
either central banks or the banking supervisors. They should be thinking about that. My personal view is that we should go for that. In fact, China may have the best condition for introducing this measure earlier, because we have definition of green loans for the last 5 years. We have collected the green loan information in terms of outstanding amount and also default rates. We have shown that the green loan default rates are much lower than non-green loan default rates.
Interesting.
So based
it's safer.
on
So it's just safer.
stability perspective, it justifies reduction of risk weights for green.
So clearly, I mean, there's a number of drivers for China to be doing this. Environmental conditions are an important driver. I mean, clearly the awareness of climate change, but also how important is the economic opportunity here in terms of transforming. I mean, we have China to thank, I think, in many ways for scaling up the production and bringing down the costs of much of the clean technology, wind and solar. Obviously, the German taxpayer for the initial sort of support, but China's really scaled up manufacturing and helped bring those costs down dramatically. So, is it really seen as a major economic opportunity?
It's clear to us that green finance, by promoting green economy, it can enhance economic growth rather than reducing economic growth and destroying jobs. In fact, in areas such as solar, wind, water treatment, subway, railway, and all that, the green finance supported projects can grow much faster than the rest of the economy. So it's growth enhancing. And second thing is really about technology development. Many of these new green areas require technology, and innovation requires finance. So finance in the green sector, again, is a major impetus for technology innovation.
Fascinating. And just, I mean, where do you think, I mean, there still seems to be a resistance in many of the incumbent companies. I mean, despite all the evidence, despite even many of the companies themselves acknowledging the risks of climate change. I'm thinking of some of the big fossil fuel, oil and gas companies. Do you think those companies will be able to make this transition?
I think a couple of things need to be done. One is certainly at the government level, there needs to be a signal, for the government interest in addressing this issue. Then many of the corporates will respond. The second thing is about disclosure. We need to improve disclosure of climate environmental information by all major corporates. And once this is done, I think it becomes a sort of a name and shame mechanism for those who are not performing.
Do you think, I mean, I'll be talking about this later. I mean, we're both talking at this event, but I mean, I'll be talking about the sort of disclosure we need. That needs to be decision useful disclosure, rather than just lots of disclosure. It needs to be decision useful and allow investors, I think, to compare different companies.
Right.
I mean, do you think that's...
We do look at TCFD recommendation.
This is the task force on climate-related financial
task force
disclosure.
on climate-related financial disclosure. It provides a good framework. But we also feel that just focusing on qualitative information is not enough. The market needs quantitative information.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's why in China we're putting together a template. And now it's in draft form, but we will later push it as a formal sort of requirement for listed company that may include indicators such as carbon emission, SO2, NOx, COD, energy consumption, and water consumption. These are the few which I think are the core of quantitative indicators that most listed companies will have to disclose.
Sorry, that was the final question, but really the final question. Just because you talked about governments need to send a signal, and of course, China is developing a national carbon pricing scheme, carbon market. How important is that, do you think, in this transition, in sending that signal?
Carbon market certainly is important, but it's not the only instrument. We can mobilize the support from banks and other institutional investors, by internally generating incentive. For example, incentivizing their green lending behavior, green bond issuance by some sort of subsidies or performance measurement and so on. But if on top of that we have carbon price as incentive, I think that strengthens the green behavior.
Well, thank you, Dr. Ma Jun. What an amazing place to have this conversation. It really makes it...
It looks great, but it's freezing.
It is bloody cold.
Yeah.
Remember to subscribe to the channel and follow these conversations with yet another climate rock star, Dr. Ma Jun. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You're a very good interviewer.
Thank you. Wow, there can't be a more inspiring place. What I was struck by, when there's no one around or cars, it's just how quiet